Story 1. The Repeating Mile Marker. Marcus Chen had been hauling freight across I-80 for 12 years, and he prided himself on knowing every rest stop, every speed trap, and every quirk of that endless ribbon of asphalt stretching from California to New Jersey. He'd driven through blizzards that turned the highway into a white nightmare, through summer heat that made the pavement shimmer like water, and through fog so thick he could barely see his own hood. Nothing rattled him anymore, or so he thought until that October night in western Nebraska. He'd left Cheyenne just after sunset, his rig loaded with manufacturing equipment, bound for Des Moines. The weather was perfect, clear and cool, with a full moon hanging low on the horizon. Marcus settled into his seat, adjusted his thermos of coffee in the cup holder, and tuned his CB radio to channel 19, listening to the usual chatter between drivers scattered across the interstate. The highway stretched before him, empty and inviting, the broken white lines disappearing under his wheels in a hypnotic rhythm. Around mile marker 107, Marcus noticed a silver sedan parked on the shoulder, with its hazard lights blinking. It was unusual, but not alarming. People broke down all the time. He considered stopping, but saw no one standing outside the vehicle, so he maintained his speed and continued past. The digital clock on his dashboard read 9:47 p.m. He made a mental note of it, as he always did when passing stranded vehicles, in case he heard a call for help on the CB. 10 miles later, near what should have been mile marker 117, Marcus saw something that made him ease off the accelerator. There, on the shoulder, in exactly the same position, was a silver sedan with its hazard lights blinking. The same make, the same model, parked at the same angle. Marcus frowned and glanced at his GPS unit, mounted to the windshield. It showed him at mile marker 117, tracking perfectly with the signs. He keyed his CB microphone. "Any drivers eastbound on I-80 near North Platte? You see that silver sedan on the shoulder at 117? Static answered him. The CB had been full of chatter just minutes before, but now there was nothing. Not even the background hiss of distant conversations. Marcus tried adjusting the squelch, changing channels, but every frequency was dead silent. He told himself it was just a dead zone, though he'd never encountered one on this stretch before. He checked his mirrors and accelerated back to cruising speed, shaking off the coincidence. Plenty of silver sedans on the road. Maybe the first one had pulled back onto the highway and broken down again. But the gnawing feeling in his gut told him something different. The position had been identical, down to the angle of the wheels and the precise distance from the white line. Marcus kept driving, his eyes flicking between the road and his mirrors. The moon had climbed higher, casting long shadows across the prairie on either side of the highway. He passed mile marker 118, then 119. At 120, he reached for his coffee, took a long drink, and tried to focus on the simple rhythm of driving. The white lines disappeared beneath him. The engine hummed its familiar song. Everything was normal. Then he saw it again, at mile marker 127. The same silver sedan, same position, hazard lights blinking in the exact same pattern. Marcus felt his heart rate spike. He slowed the rig to 40 miles per hour, staring at the vehicle as he approached. This time he could see through the rear window. The interior light was on, and he could make out the back of a driver's head, someone sitting motionless behind the wheel. Marcus grabbed his CB microphone with shaking hands. "This is Dragonfly eastbound at 127. Does anyone copy? Anyone at all?" Nothing but silence answered him. The CB radio's green display glowed in the darkness of his cab, all indicators showing it was functioning normally, but it was as if every other driver had vanished from the airwaves. Marcus passed the sedan, craning his neck to look, but he couldn't see the driver's face, only that still silhouette. He checked his fuel gauge. 3/4 of a tank, plenty to reach the next truck stop. He considered pulling over, waiting for another vehicle to pass, confirming he wasn't losing his mind, but something deeper than logic told him to keep moving. At mile marker 137, the sedan appeared again. Same vehicle, same position, same blinking hazards. Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. The logical part of his brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was misreading the mile markers. Maybe the GPS was glitching. But deep down, he knew what he was seeing was impossible, and that made it infinitely more terrifying. He decided to count the mile markers carefully, watching each one pass with deliberate attention. 138, 139, 140. His speedometer held steady at 65 miles per hour. His GPS tracked perfectly with the markers. At 147, the sedan was there again, and this time Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. The license plate was his own truck's plate number. He blinked hard, certain he'd misread it in the moonlight. But no, the combination of letters and numbers was burned into his memory from years of paperwork and inspection reports. "What the hell is happening?" Marcus said aloud, his voice sounding strange and small in the cab. He rolled down his window, letting the cold October air blast his face, confirming he was awake, that this was real. The wind roared in his ears, but beneath it, he thought he heard something else, a low humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. At mile marker 157, the sedan appeared again, but this time, something had changed. The driver's door was open, hanging at an odd angle, and the interior light illuminated an empty driver's seat. The headrest was stained with something dark that glistened in the moonlight. Marcus's foot moved instinctively to the brake, but he forced himself to keep driving. Every instinct screamed at him not to stop, not to investigate, to just keep moving forward no matter what. The pattern continued with mechanical precision. Every 10 miles, at markers ending in 7, the sedan appeared. Each time, it had changed in some small, horrible way. At 106th, both front doors were open. At 107th, the windshield was shattered, spider-webbed cracks spreading from a central impact point. At 187, the entire vehicle was tilted at an impossible angle, as if preparing to flip, yet remaining perfectly still. Marcus had been driving for what felt like hours, but when he checked his dashboard clock, only 23 minutes had passed since he'd first seen the sedan at mile marker 107. Time itself seemed to be breaking down around him, stretching and compressing in ways that defied explanation. He fumbled for his cell phone, thinking he'd call dispatch, call anyone. But the screen showed no signal, despite the clear night and open prairie. At mile marker 197, the sedan was completely overturned, resting on its crushed roof, all 4 wheels pointing at the sky. The hazard lights still blinked with metronomic regularity. As Marcus passed, something moved inside the wreckage. A hand, pale and dirt-streaked, reached out from the driver's window and pointed directly at his truck. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing the rig faster than was safe, desperate to put distance between himself and whatever was happening. The mile markers continued to pass. 198, 199, 200. He held his breath approaching 207, but the shoulder was empty. Relief flooded through him, so intense it made him dizzy. Maybe it was over. Maybe he'd passed through whatever impossible thing had been happening. The CB radio suddenly crackled to life, and a driver's voice cut through the static. "Eastbound traffic, be advised. There's a bad accident at mile marker 207. Silver sedan overturned. Emergency crews on scene." Marcus's relief evaporated instantly. He was at mile marker 203, approaching 204. In 3 miles, he would reach 207, and according to the CB, the accident was already there, had already happened. But he hadn't passed it yet. He was living in the moments before it occurred, and the knowledge of it was somehow reaching backward to him. When he finally crossed mile marker 207, there was nothing on the shoulder. No sedan, no emergency vehicles, no accident at all. Just empty highway stretching endlessly into the darkness. The CB chatter continued normally, drivers discussing weather and road conditions, as if the warning about the accident had never been broadcast. Marcus tried to respond, to ask about what he'd heard, but his voice wouldn't work. His hands trembled on the wheel. He drove through the night in a daze, questioning everything he'd experienced. At the North Platte truck stop, he pulled in just after midnight according to his clock, though his GPS and phone both insisted it was 11:34 p.m. He went inside, bought coffee he didn't drink, and asked the clerk if she'd heard about any accidents on I-80 that evening. She said it had been quiet, unusually so. Hadn't seen more than a dozen vehicles pass by all night. Marcus got back in his truck as the sky began to lighten with false dawn. He checked his logbook and found entries he didn't remember writing, notes about stops he didn't recall making, all in his own handwriting. The date at the top of the page was wrong, showing yesterday's date, as if the entire night hadn't happened yet, or was still happening in some parallel stream of time. He completed his delivery to Des Moines, though he couldn't remember the drive. The receiving clerk mentioned he was early, had arrived a full day ahead of schedule, which was impossible given when he'd left Cheyenne. Marcus smiled, signed the paperwork, and didn't argue. Now, 5 years later, Marcus still drives I-80, still hauls freight across that same stretch of Nebraska highway. He's never seen the silver sedan again, but every time he approaches a mile marker ending in 7, his heart races and his hands grip the wheel a little tighter. Sometimes, late at night when the highway is empty and the moon is full, he'll catch the CB broadcasting conversations that haven't happened yet, warnings about accidents ahead that he'll never encounter, or reports of vehicles that don't exist. He's learned to ignore them, to keep his eyes on the road and his foot steady on the accelerator. But he knows, with absolute certainty, that he's driving through moments that aren't quite linear anymore, that somewhere on that dark October night, time folded in on itself and never quite unfolded the right way again. And every trip across I-80, he wonders if this will be the night he finally meets himself coming the other way, or if he'll see that silver sedan one more time and finally understand what it was trying to show him all along. Story 2. The facility that wasn't there. Raymond Ray Kowalski had been running independent freight contracts for 18 years, specializing in rush deliveries that required driving through the night when most truckers were sleeping in rest stops or motels. He knew the back highways of the Midwest better than his own hometown, could navigate by instinct through areas where GPS signals flickered and died, where the only lights came from distant farmhouses scattered across the darkness. The job paid well, precisely because most drivers refused to take routes through the empty places, the forgotten counties where highways narrowed to 2 lanes, and civilization seemed to retreat. On a humid July night, Ray picked up a rush delivery in Indianapolis, bound for a small manufacturing plant outside of Ottumwa, Iowa. The cargo was medical equipment, expensive and time-sensitive, packed in climate-controlled containers that hummed softly in his trailer. The route was straightforward. Take Highway 63 north through rural Illinois, cut across the Mississippi River, then head west on increasingly small state roads until he reached the facility. His GPS had the destination programmed, a simple warehouse complex that, according to the shipping manifest, had been operating for 15 years. Ray left Indianapolis at 10 p.m., making good time through the still warm night. The radio played classic rock, and he sang along absently, watching the mile markers tick by with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent most of his adult life behind a wheel. By midnight, he'd crossed into Illinois, and the landscape began to change. Farmland giving way to longer stretches of woods, broken only occasionally by farmhouses or small towns that seemed frozen in the 1970s. Around 2 a.m., his GPS directed him to take a right turn onto County Road 47, a narrow strip of asphalt that cut through dense forest. The transition was abrupt and unsettling. One moment he was on a well-maintained state highway, with occasional traffic. The next he was alone on a road so narrow that tree branches scraped against both sides of his trailer. The GPS showed 7 miles to his destination, and Ray settled in, expecting a straight shot to the facility. The forest pressed in from both sides, thick and primal, the kind of old-growth woods that had somehow escaped development. Ray's headlights penetrated only about 50 feet before being swallowed by the darkness. No moonlight penetrated the canopy. No houses or farms broke the endless wall of trees. The only sound was his engine and the whisper of tires on pavement. After what felt like 15 minutes of driving, Ray glanced at his GPS and frowned. It still showed 7 miles to destination. He checked his speedometer, 45 miles per hour, exactly what he'd been maintaining. He should have covered at least 10 miles, but according to the GPS, he was in the same position relative to his destination as when he'd turned onto County Road 47. Ray tapped the GPS screen, wondering if it had frozen, but the little icon representing his truck moved smoothly along the road line. Everything appeared functional. He kept driving, watching the odometer tick away tenths of a mile, while the GPS stubbornly insisted he was still 7 miles from his destination. A cold feeling began to creep up his spine, completely at odds with the humid July air coming through his vents. Then the trees ended abruptly, and Ray found himself approaching a facility that blazed with lights in the middle of absolute nowhere. It was enormous, easily the size of several football fields, a sprawling complex of modern buildings surrounded by chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Massive floodlights illuminated parking lots filled with vehicles, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The whole place hummed with activity despite the hour. Figures moving between buildings, forklifts carrying pallets, the organized chaos of a facility running at full capacity. Ray pulled up to the gate, where a guard station stood empty. A sign next to the entrance read, "Hendrickson Medical Supply, authorized personnel only." He keyed his CB microphone out of habit, though he didn't expect a response in such a remote location. "This is Flatbed Ray approaching Hendrickson Medical Supply on County Road 47. Anyone from the facility monitoring?" Static answered him, but then a voice cut through, clear and professional. "Copy that, Flatbed Ray. Proceed to loading Dock 7. Someone will meet you there." The voice had a strange quality to it, too crisp, as if it had been recorded and played back rather than spoken in real time. The gate swung open automatically, and Ray drove through, following signs that directed him toward the loading docks. As he navigated the facility's internal roads, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. The place was too clean, too perfectly organized, every line and angle precise in a way that seemed almost artificial. The vehicles in the parking lots were all identical white vans with no markings or license plates. The people he saw moving between buildings wore matching blue coveralls and moved with synchronized efficiency that seemed more choreographed than natural. Loading Dock 7 was at the far end of the complex, isolated from the other docks by a wide stretch of empty pavement. Ray backed his trailer up to the dock with practiced precision, set his air brakes, and climbed down from the cab. The humidity hit him immediately, thick and oppressive, but underneath it was something else, a chemical smell he couldn't identify, sharp and acrid. A man in blue coveralls emerged from the dock door, carrying a clipboard. He was middle-aged, with a forgettable face, and eyes that seemed to look through Ray rather than at him. "Raymond Kowalski?" he asked, his voice having that same recorded quality as the CB transmission. "That's me," Ray said, pulling out his delivery paperwork. "Got medical equipment from Indianapolis, climate-controlled, time-sensitive." The man took the papers without looking at them and nodded. "We'll handle the unloading. It'll take approximately 40 minutes. You're welcome to wait in the driver's lounge." He pointed to a door at the side of the loading dock. "Through there, up the stairs, first door on your left." Ray normally would have stayed with his truck, but something about the man's tone made it seem less like an offer and more like an instruction. Besides, he was curious about the facility, wanted to see the inside, to confirm it was real and ordinary, despite his growing unease. He walked through the door and climbed a stairwell that smelled of disinfectant and something metallic he couldn't place. The driver's lounge was small and surprisingly dated, furnished with furniture that looked like it came from the 1980s, all brown upholstery and fake wood paneling. A coffee maker sat on a counter, surrounded by styrofoam cups. A window overlooked the loading dock. Ray poured himself coffee and sat down, watching through the window as his trailer was unloaded with mechanical efficiency by workers who moved in perfect synchronization. That's when he noticed the clock on the wall. It read 2:47 a.m., but his watch showed 3:53 a.m. He checked his phone, which confirmed his watch, 3:53 a.m. The clock on the wall ticked backward as he watched, moving from 2:47 to 2:46. Ray stood up, walked over to it, and saw that the second hand was rotating counterclockwise. A deep chill ran through him despite the humid air. He turned to the window and noticed other details he'd missed before. The workers unloading his trailer cast no shadows despite the bright floodlights. Their movements, which had seemed efficient, now appeared looped, repeating the same actions in the same sequence every 30 seconds. One worker would lift a box, carry it exactly 12 steps, hand it to another worker, return to the trailer, and lift the exact same box again. Ray set down his coffee and walked quickly to the door, suddenly desperate to get back to his truck. But when he tried the handle, it wouldn't turn, locked from the outside. He pulled harder, feeling panic rise in his chest, and finally the door gave way, nearly sending him sprawling down the stairs. He descended quickly, emerged onto the loading dock, and found it empty. His trailer stood open, completely unloaded, though only 10 minutes had passed since he'd gone upstairs. The paperwork was on his driver's seat, signed and stamped with a delivery time of 2:47 a.m. Ray's hands shook as he examined it. Everything appeared in order, but the signature was his own handwriting, and he hadn't signed it. He climbed into his cab, started the engine, and drove toward the exit, watching the facility in his mirrors. The workers continued their looped movements. The white vans sat in their perfect rows, and the whole complex maintained its humming activity. The gate was open when he reached it. Ray drove through and back onto County Road 47, where the forest immediately swallowed him again. His GPS now showed the route back to the state highway, a simple path that should take 15 minutes. But as he drove, the trees seemed to press closer, and his odometer climbed, while his GPS showed him getting no closer to the highway. Then, after what might have been an hour or only a few minutes, the trees simply ended, and he was back on Highway 63, as if County Road 47 had spit him out. Ray pulled into the first truck stop he found, parked under the brightest lights available, and went inside. The clerk was cheerful, asked if he needed anything. Ray asked if she knew about Hendrickson Medical Supply, described the massive facility on County Road 47. The clerk frowned and shook her head. There's nothing on County Road 47 except woods. Used to be an old state hospital out that way. Got closed down in the 60s, but it was torn down decades ago. Just forest now. She pulled out a local map and showed him. County Road 47 was marked, but there were no buildings indicated along its length, no facilities, nothing but 7 miles of woods between the highway and where the road dead-ended at a river. Ray drove to Ottumwa as the sky lightened, delivered his paperwork to his dispatcher, and said nothing about the facility. His dispatcher confirmed receipt of the delivery, said the client had sent notification that everything had arrived on time and in perfect condition. But when Ray asked for the client's name, his dispatcher looked confused. Says here you delivered to Hendrickson Medical Supply, but I don't have any contact information for them. Just a routing number that directed you to the coordinates. Over the following weeks, Ray tried to find evidence of the facility. He searched online for Hendrickson Medical Supply and found nothing. He drove back to County Road 47 and found exactly what the clerk had described. 7 miles of forest with no buildings, no signs of recent development, just trees and darkness. He filed a Freedom of Information request for the property records along County Road 47 and received documents showing the land had been owned by the state since 1963, undeveloped and unused. But the delivery paperwork remained, signed and stamped, proof that he'd been somewhere and delivered something to someone. Ray kept a copy of it in his truck, would sometimes take it out and examine it in the lights of truck stops and rest areas, trying to understand what had happened that July night. The signature that was his but wasn't his. The timestamp that didn't match any clock he'd seen. The delivery address that led to nothing but trees. Ray still drives the same routes through the Midwest, still takes the rush deliveries that require navigating through the dark and empty places. But he's developed new habits, compulsive rituals that he can't quite explain. He never accepts deliveries without confirming the destination on 3 separate mapping services. He photographs every facility he delivers to, saving the images as proof that the place existed. And he never, under any circumstances, turns onto County Road 47, even though his GPS sometimes suggests it as a shortcut, even though the route would save him 90 minutes on certain runs. He takes the long way, drives the extra miles, and tells himself that some deliveries aren't worth making no matter what they pay. Because Ray knows, with absolute certainty, that the facility is still there, still humming with activity, still waiting for the next driver who makes the wrong turn and finds themselves delivering cargo to a place that officially doesn't exist, to workers who cast no shadows, to a building that operates in a time that runs backward and forward simultaneously, and that no one who delivers there ever quite leaves. Not completely, because part of them remains trapped in that eternal 2:47 a.m., unloading the same boxes in the same sequence forever. Story 3. The Passenger Who Wasn't. Denise Murphy had been driving a semi for 6 years, one of the few women in long-haul trucking, and she'd heard every joke, every comment, every assumption about what she could or couldn't handle. She'd proven herself 100 times over, driving through conditions that sent experienced drivers to motels, navigating docks that supposedly only men could handle, and maintaining a safety record that was the envy of her entire company. She drove alone, preferred it that way, and had never been afraid of the solitude that came with crossing empty states in the middle of the night. Until the night she picked up a passenger she never stopped for. It was mid-March, and Denise was hauling furniture from a warehouse in Memphis to a distribution center in Albuquerque. She'd been on the road for 6 hours, crossing through Arkansas on Interstate 40, when she stopped at a truck stop near Forest City to refuel and grab dinner. The place was busy, filled with drivers escaping the cold drizzle that had been falling since sunset. Denise filled her tank, parked, and went inside for a quick meal. She ate alone at the counter, reviewing her route on her tablet, planning her fuel stops and rest breaks. The television above the counter showed local news. A story about a missing woman, Margaret Hollis, 63 years old, last seen at a truck stop on I-40 near West Memphis 3 days ago. Denise glanced at the photo, committed it to memory out of habit, the way she always did with missing person reports. Dark hair gone grey, glasses, wearing a blue windbreaker. Then she paid her bill, used the restroom, and walked back out into the drizzle. Her truck was where she'd left it, lights off, doors locked. Denise climbed into the cab, started the engine, and pulled back onto the interstate, settling into the rhythm of driving. The wipers beat a steady pattern across her windshield. The radio played country music, low and comfortable. She was making good time, would reach Oklahoma City by morning if traffic stayed light. About 40 miles past the truck stop, somewhere in the empty stretch between Forest City and Brinkley, Denise glanced at her passenger seat and felt her heart nearly stop. There was a woman sitting there. An older woman, maybe 60, with dark hair gone grey and glasses, wearing a blue windbreaker. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead through the windshield. Denise jerked the wheel involuntarily, nearly sending the truck into the median before she corrected. "Jesus," she shouted, her voice high and panicked. "Who the hell are you? How did you get in my truck?" The woman didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that Denise had spoken. She just continued staring ahead, her expression neutral, almost serene. Denise's mind raced. The truck had been locked. She'd checked the passenger side when she did her pre-trip inspection. No one could have gotten in without her knowing. But here, this woman sat, as real and solid as anything, close enough that Denise could see the fabric texture of her windbreaker. I said, "Who are you?" Denise repeated, trying to keep her voice steady. She reached for her CB microphone with one hand while keeping her eyes on the road. "You need to tell me how you got in my truck right now, or I'm calling the police." The woman turned her head slowly, mechanically, to look at Denise. Her eyes were empty, not in an emotional sense, but in a literal one, void of the reflection and depth that eyes should have. They were dark holes in her face, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. When she spoke, her voice came from everywhere and nowhere, seeming to fill the cab from all directions at once. "I need to get home," she said. "I've been trying to get home." Denise's blood turned to ice. She recognized the woman now, had seen her face on the news less than an hour ago. Margaret Hollis, missing for 3 days. Except Margaret Hollis wasn't missing anymore. She was sitting in Denise's truck, and there was no possible way she could be. "Ma'am, I need you to tell me where you live," Denise said, her training overriding her terror. "I'll get you there, or I'll get you to a police station. But you need to talk to me, okay? Help me understand what's happening." Margaret turned to look forward again. "I got confused," she said, in that omnidirectional voice. "I was trying to find my daughter. She lives in Little Rock. I thought I could catch a ride, but I got confused, and now I can't find my way back." Denise's hands were shaking on the wheel. She glanced at the passenger seat again, and Margaret was still there, solid and real and completely impossible. "When did you last remember being somewhere?" Denise asked, trying to keep her engaged, trying to understand. "Tuesday," Margaret said. "I was at the truck stop. I asked a driver if he could give me a ride toward Little Rock, but he said no. So I waited. I've been waiting, but I can't find the door anymore. Can you help me find the door?" It was Thursday night. Margaret had been missing since Tuesday afternoon. Denise fumbled for her cell phone, nearly dropping it, and tried to dial 911 with trembling fingers. The phone showed 4 bars of signal, but when she tried to connect the call, it went immediately to a strange tone. Not a busy signal or error message, but something else. A low frequency that made her teeth ache. "I just need to get home," Margaret said again. "My daughter is worried. I can feel her worrying. It pulls at me, but I can't find the way." Denise ended the call and tried her CB radio instead. "This is southbound I-40 at mile marker 216. Does anyone copy? I have an emergency situation." Static answered her, thick and somehow wrong, like the sound of rain, but deeper, more resonant. "Anyone copy? I need assistance at mile marker 216. "They can't hear you," Margaret said calmly. "I tried to call too. The phone didn't work. Nothing works right anymore. It's like being underwater, trying to hear sounds from the surface." Denise risked another glance at her passenger and saw that Margaret was becoming translucent, fading at the edges. Through her body, Denise could see the passenger door, the window, the dark highway beyond. "What's happening to you?" Denise whispered. "I think I'm lost," Margaret said, and for the first time, emotion entered her voice. A desperate sadness that made Denise's chest tighten. I think I've been lost for longer than 3 days. It feels like forever. It feels like I've been in trucks and cars and buses, asking for help, trying to get home. But I can't find the way. Can you see me? Really see me? Yes, Denise said, tears streaming down her face now. I see you. You're right here. Margaret smiled, and it was a terrible thing, full of relief and horror intertwined. Thank you, she said. No one else has seen me since Tuesday. They look right through me, or they run away screaming. But you see me. That means I'm still here. That means I'm still real. The truck's interior lights began to flicker, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. Denise could see her breath fogging in the air. The radio cycled through stations on its own, fragments of songs and voices blending into incomprehensible noise. Margaret was barely visible now, just an outline, a suggestion of a person sitting in the passenger seat. I'm scared, Margaret whispered, her voice fading. I don't know what's happening. I don't know where I am anymore. Everything is mixed up. Tuesday is happening at the same time as Thursday, and I can see myself at the truck stop still waiting. But I'm also here, and I'm also somewhere else, somewhere dark and cold, and I don't understand. Denise wiped her eyes and forced herself to focus. Tell me about your daughter, she said. What's her name? Sarah, Margaret said, her form solidifying slightly at the mention. Sarah Hollis. She's a teacher, 3rd grade. She has 2 children, my grandchildren, Emma and Jack. They're 7 and 5. I was supposed to watch them this week, but I got confused on the way, and now I can't find them. I'll find Sarah, Denise promised. I'll tell her you were trying to get home. I'll tell her you didn't mean to disappear. Can you tell me anything else? Anything that might help? Margaret reached out a hand, and Denise steeled herself, expecting it to pass through her arm like mist. But Margaret's fingers were solid and cold, impossibly cold, and they gripped Denise's forearm with desperate strength. The driver, Margaret said urgently. The one who said no. He didn't say no. I remember now. He smiled, and I got in, and then it's all confused. Dark, cold. He took me somewhere, but I can't remember where. Off the highway, a side road. There was a building, or maybe just woods. But I remember being scared, remember trying to run, and then... Her voice trailed, off, and her grip loosened. Denise looked at the passenger seat, and Margaret was gone, simply vanished, as if she'd never been there. The temperature returned to normal. The radio stabilized. The only evidence that anything had happened was the cold, wet spot on Denise's forearm, where Margaret had gripped her, and the smell of earth and decay that lingered in the cab. Denise pulled onto the shoulder, her whole body shaking. She turned on every light in the truck, flooding the cab with brightness, and sat there for 10 minutes, trying to steady her breathing, trying to convince herself she hadn't lost her mind. Then she picked up her phone, found the number for the Arkansas State Police, and this time the call connected. She reported everything, every detail of the encounter, knowing how it sounded, not caring. The dispatcher took the information with professional calm, thanked her, and said someone would follow up. Denise gave them her contact information, described Margaret Hollis, repeated everything the woman had said about the driver and the side road. 3 days later, Denise received a call from a detective in Arkansas. They'd found Margaret Hollis's body in a wooded area off a service road near West Memphis, less than 5 miles from the truck stop where she was last seen. She'd been murdered, the victim of a truck driver who'd been killing women for at least 5 years, targeting older women traveling alone at truck stops along I-40. The man was in custody, arrested after other evidence connected him to multiple disappearances. The detective asked Denise how she'd known to report the specific details she'd provided, details that matched the crime scene and the suspect's confession. Denise told the truth, said she'd encountered Margaret in her truck, that the woman had appeared in her passenger seat, and told her she was lost. The detective was silent for a long time, then simply thanked her and ended the call. Denise still drives long-haul routes, still crosses I-40 through Arkansas several times a month. But she's never comfortable in that stretch between Forest City and Little Rock. She keeps her doors locked obsessively, checks her cab multiple times before getting on the highway. And sometimes, late at night, when she's alone on empty interstate, she glances at her passenger seat and sees shapes that might be people, shadows that might be desperate souls trying to find their way home. She never stops for hitchhikers anymore, never picks up passengers of any kind, because she knows now that some passengers don't need doors to get inside, don't need invitations, don't need to be alive. They just need someone who can see them, someone who can carry their last messages, someone who can help them find the way home, even after they've already arrived at the final destination they never wanted to reach. Story 4. The CB radio that spoke tomorrow. Thomas Brennan had been running interstate routes for 22 years, and his CB radio was his constant companion, the voice that broke the monotony of endless highway and kept him connected to the invisible community of drivers scattered across the country. He knew the regular voices on the common channels, could recognize drivers by their handle and speech patterns, and had built friendships with people he'd never met in person, but talked to every night on the road. The CB was more than equipment to Thomas. It was the thread that connected him to a world of shared experience and mutual support. On a bitter cold January night, Thomas was hauling auto parts from Detroit to Nashville, running southbound on I-65 through Kentucky. Snow had been falling since he crossed the Ohio border, not heavy enough to stop traffic, but sufficient to make the driving treacherous and slow. Most drivers had pulled off at truck stops to wait out the worst of the weather. But Thomas had a tight deadline and decades of experience driving in snow. He'd reduced his speed to 40 miles per hour, left his hazard lights on, and kept the CB tuned to Channel 19, listening to reports from other drivers about road conditions ahead. Around 11 p.m., somewhere between Elizabethtown and Munfordville, Thomas's CB crackled to life with unusual clarity. A voice he didn't recognize came through, male and young, with a southern accent. Northbound traffic, be advised. There's a major accident at mile marker 82. Multiple vehicles, including a jackknifed semi-blocking both lanes. Emergency crews are on scene, but it's going to be hours before it's clear. Recommend taking exit 76 and using Highway 218 as alternate route. Thomas frowned. He was currently at mile marker 78, heading south, not north. The warning was for northbound traffic, which wouldn't concern him. But something about the transmission bothered him. The voice had been too clear, too present, without the usual static and distance that colored most CB transmissions. He keyed his microphone. "This is long-haul Tommy southbound at 78, who's reporting the accident at 82. That's ahead of me." Silence answered him. Thomas tried again. Any driver with information about the accident at 82, please advise. Long-haul Tommy requesting clarification. The same voice came back, but this time it sounded confused. Negative, long-haul Tommy. The accident is northbound lanes only. Southbound is clear. You should see it in about 4 miles at your current speed. Whole northbound side is shut down. Thomas's grip tightened on the wheel. He was heading south. An accident in the northbound lanes shouldn't affect him except for rubbernecking delays. He continued driving, watching carefully, and sure enough, at mile marker 82, he saw exactly what the voice had described. A massive pile-up in the northbound lanes. Multiple vehicles, including a jackknifed semi, completely blocking both northbound lanes. Emergency vehicles with flashing lights creating a chaotic light show in the falling snow. The southbound lanes were clear, and Thomas passed by slowly, watching the accident in his mirrors. He keyed his CB again, confirming the accident at 82. Northbound lanes completely blocked, just as reported. Good warning for northbound traffic. Who was it that called this in? I want to thank you for the heads up. The same voice responded immediately. That was me, long-haul Tommy. Handles Kentucky Kid. But I'm confused about your location. You said you were southbound, but I'm looking at a southbound accident at 82, not northbound. Are you sure you're heading south? A cold feeling unrelated to the January weather crept down Thomas's spine. Kentucky Kid, I just passed mile marker 82, and the accident is definitely northbound lanes. I'm southbound, currently at marker 83. The southbound lanes are clear. Negative, Tommy, the voice insisted, now sounding worried. I'm standing outside my truck at mile marker 83 right now, looking at the southbound accident. Major pileup, at least 8 vehicles, started about 10 minutes ago. You couldn't have passed through here because it's completely blocked. Thomas looked in his mirrors. Behind him, the road was empty, except for the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles at mile marker 82, all in the northbound lanes. Ahead of him, the highway stretched clear and snow-covered. Kentucky Kid, I don't know what you're seeing, but I promise you, the southbound lanes are clear. I just drove through this area. Another voice cut into the channel, older and gravelly. This is Iron Horse monitoring from mile marker 91. Kentucky Kid, you're talking about the accident that's going to happen, not the one that already did. Check your clock. What do you mean, going to happen? Kentucky Kid's voice rose in pitch. It happened 10 minutes ago. I watched it happen. I called it in immediately. Check your clock, Iron Horse repeated. Then check it again in 5 minutes. Tell me what you see. Thomas's hands were shaking now. He checked his own dashboard clock. 11:17 p.m. His phone showed the same time. He kept driving, his eyes flicking between the road and the clock, watching the minutes advance normally. 11:18, 11:19, 11:20. Kentucky. Kid's voice came back on the CB, barely controlled panic evident. My clock says 11:52. My phone says 11:52. But 5 minutes ago it said 11:52. The time isn't changing. I've been watching it, and it's stuck at 11:52. Iron Horse's voice was calm, almost sad. Son, you're broadcasting from about 35 minutes in the future. Don't ask me how or why, because I don't understand it either. I've been monitoring this channel for 30 years, and sometimes, maybe once or twice a year, someone comes through from a time that hasn't happened yet. They report accidents that haven't occurred, weather that hasn't arrived. Sometimes they warn about things we can still prevent. That's impossible, Thomas said. But even as he spoke, he was checking his own clock obsessively, making sure time was still passing normally for him. Lot of impossible things happen on these highways at night, Iron Horse responded. Kentucky Kid, listen to me carefully. What you're experiencing is real, but you need to accept that you're somewhere the rest of us aren't yet. Can you describe exactly what happened at mile marker 82 in your timeline? Kentucky Kid's voice was shaking. A southbound semi hit a patch of black ice and jackknifed. That triggered a pileup behind it. At least 8 vehicles involved, maybe more. I saw it happen, saw the semi's brake lights flash right before it went sideways. It was hauling auto parts, blue cab with white trailer. Thomas's blood ran cold. He was the only southbound semi in this stretch. Blue cab, white trailer, hauling auto parts. Kentucky Kid, was there anyone? Did anyone not make it? A long pause. Then, Tommy, I can see your truck in the pileup. It's the worst hit. The cab is crushed. I'm sorry, man. I don't think anyone could survive that. Thomas's foot moved instinctively toward the brake, but Iron Horse's voice cut through. Tommy, don't panic. You're at mile marker 83 right now, correct? And Kentucky Kid is reporting an accident at 82 that happens at 11:52. That's right, Thomas confirmed, his voice barely a whisper. Then you have 33 minutes to change what happens, Iron Horse said. You're at 83, which means you've already passed the accident site. In Kentucky Kid's timeline, you hit the black ice at 82 at 11:52. But you passed through 82 around 11:20 and you were fine. Something is different. I don't understand, Thomas said. If I already passed that spot, how can I have an accident there at 11:52? Because you're going to turn around, Kentucky Kid said, his voice suddenly clear and certain. At mile marker 91, you're going to get word that the accident at 82 northbound has injured someone you know, someone you've been talking to on the CB for years. And you're going to turn around, going to head back north to help. And that's when you hit the ice. Thomas felt the truth of it in his bones. He would turn around. He would absolutely turn around if someone he knew was hurt, would risk the bad weather and dangerous roads to help a fellow driver. It was the code they lived by, the unwritten rule that bound the community together. So what do I do? Thomas asked. I can't just abandon someone who needs help. The accident at 82 northbound, Iron Horse said slowly. In Kentucky Kid's timeline, does it involve a driver with the handle Silverback? Yeah, Kentucky Kid confirmed. Silverback is hurt pretty bad. That's who Tommy turns around for. They're friends, talk on the CB almost every night. Thomas's heart sank. Silverback was Brian Collins, one of his closest friends in the trucking community. They'd been talking on the CB for 15 years, met in person a handful of times at truck shows. If Brian was hurt, Thomas would absolutely turn around, no question. Here's what you do, Tommy, Iron Horse said. In about 12 minutes, you're going to get to exit 76. Take it. Get off the highway. Go to the truck stop there, and wait for at least an hour. By then, the timeline Kentucky Kid is in will have passed. The accident he's describing won't happen because you won't be on the highway at 11:52. But what about Silverback? Thomas protested. If he's hurt in the northbound accident, I need to help. Tommy, Iron Horse said gently, the northbound accident happens in all timelines. I'm monitoring it right now in our timeline, and Silverback is there, but he's fine. Shaken up, but not hurt. The serious injuries in that accident don't happen until someone causes a secondary collision, and that someone is you when you turn around. By turning around to help, you make everything worse. You cause more injuries, and you die in the process. Thomas drove in silence, his mind reeling. The exit for 76 was coming up. He could see the sign ahead. Everything in him wanted to stay on the highway, to be there if Brian needed him. But the voices on the CB were telling him a truth he couldn't deny, that his attempt to help would only cause more harm. "Kentucky kid," Thomas said quietly, "can you see what happens after the accident? After my truck crashes?" Another long pause. The secondary collision causes a fuel spill. There's a fire. 3 more vehicles get caught in it before everyone can evacuate. 2 people die in the fire. One of them is Silverback, who survived the initial accident, but came back to try to help pull survivors from your truck. Thomas felt tears on his face. He would cause Brian's death by trying to save him. The horrible paradox of it was almost too much to process. He put on his turn signal and took exit 76, pulling off the highway and into the truck stop parking lot. He parked, shut down the engine, and sat in the darkness, watching his clock tick toward 11:52. "Tommy," Kentucky Kid's voice came through the CB. "Something's changing. The accident is still here at 82, but your truck isn't in it anymore. The pileup is smaller. Silverback is helping pull someone from a car, but he's okay. The fire isn't happening. Tommy, you changed it. Whatever you did, you changed it." "I got off the highway," Thomas said, his voice hollow. "I'm at the truck stop at exit 76. "Stay there," Iron Horse commanded. "Don't get back on until after midnight. Let this timeline pass completely." Thomas sat in the truck stop for 2 hours, drinking coffee he couldn't taste, watching the clock advance normally, confirming that time was still passing the right way for him. At 12:15 a.m., he called Brian Collins on his cell phone. Brian answered immediately, his voice tired but cheerful. "Tommy, hell of a night, huh? I was in an accident up near Elizabethtown, nothing serious, but it's got traffic backed up for miles. Where are you?" "Truck stop at exit 76, Thomas said. "Pulled off to wait out the weather. You're really okay?" "Yeah, man, I'm fine. Truck's a little banged up, but nothing major." "Why?" "Just heard about the accident on the CB and wanted to make sure," Thomas said, not mentioning that he'd heard about it from someone broadcasting from a future that no longer existed. After the call, Thomas tried to raise Kentucky Kid or Iron Horse on the CB, cycling through all the channels, but neither voice responded. He never heard from Kentucky Kid again, though he listened for that particular voice and accent every night for months afterward. Iron Horse he encountered one more time, about 6 months later, broadcasting from somewhere in Montana. Thomas asked him about that night, asked if it had really happened. Iron Horse's response was simple. "The highways at night are thin places, Tommy. Time doesn't always move the way we think it should. Sometimes information leaks backward, gives us a chance to change things. You got lucky. You heard the warning and you listened. Most people don't. They drive right into their futures thinking they can handle it, thinking they know better. You're alive because you trusted voices from a time you couldn't see." Thomas still drives I-65, still hauls freight between Detroit and Nashville. He still talks on his CB every night, still maintains the friendships and connections that sustained him through decades on the road. But he's developed new habits that other drivers find strange. He takes exits for no apparent reason, pulls off the highway at random truck stops, and waits for time to pass. When asked why, he says he's just being cautious, just waiting for weather to clear or traffic to thin. He never mentions the voices from tomorrow, or the accident he died in, but also didn't, or the fact that he's living in a timeline that shouldn't exist, where he made a different choice and saved lives, including his own. And late at night, when his CB crackles with transmissions from drivers scattered across the dark highways, Thomas listens carefully to every voice, paying attention to the clarity and presence, watching his clock, making sure time is passing the way it should, ready to change course if he ever hears another voice broadcasting from a future he still has time to prevent. Because Thomas knows that somewhere out there, in a timeline that almost was, a version of him died at mile marker 82 trying to help a friend, and his death caused more deaths. And it was all documented by a young driver named Kentucky Kid, who was somehow watching from 35 minutes ahead and tried to warn anyone who would listen. And Thomas listened, and that made all the difference in the world. Story 5. The Rest Stop That Moved. Carlos Mendoza had been driving regional routes through the Southwest for 9 years, specializing in runs that took him through the less traveled highways of New Mexico, Arizona, and West Texas. He knew the desert intimately, respected its dangers, and had learned through experience exactly which rest stops had good coffee, which truck stops stayed open all night, and which stretches of highway required careful fuel management because services were few and far between. One particular rest stop on Highway 54 between Carrizozo and Alamogordo had become Carlos's regular refuge during the late-night hours. It was nothing special, just a standard rest area with bathrooms, vending machines, and a small picnic area, but it was positioned perfectly at the halfway point of a particularly lonely stretch of desert highway. Carlos stopped there at least twice a week, usually around 2 or 3 a.m., to use the restroom, grab a soda from the vending machine, and walk around for 10 minutes to keep his legs from cramping. The rest stop sat at mile marker 47, tucked into a small canyon where desert winds had carved strange formations in the sandstone. A single light pole illuminated the parking area, attracting moths and beetles in swirling clouds. Carlos had stopped there so many times he knew exactly what to expect. 4 parking spaces for cars, 2 for trucks, bathrooms that were usually clean, and vending machines that accepted both cash and cards. On a September night, Carlos pulled into the rest stop at 2:43 a.m., his truck loaded with agricultural equipment bound for Alamogordo. He was making excellent time. The highway had been empty, and he felt alert and focused despite the late hour. He parked in his usual spot, the second truck space, shut down the engine, and climbed out into the warm desert night. Everything seemed normal. The light pole cast its familiar pool of yellow light. Moths spiraled in their eternal dance. The vending machines hummed their electric song. Carlos used the restroom, bought a Dr. Pepper from the machine, and walked over to the picnic area to stretch his legs. The moon was 3/4 full, painting the desert in silver and shadow. He could hear coyotes in the distance, their yips and howls carrying across the empty land. He spent exactly 10 minutes at the rest stop, timing it on his watch as he always did, then returned to his truck. As he climbed into the cab, he glanced at his GPS to check the route, and that's when he noticed something odd. According to the GPS, he was at mile marker 52, not 47. Carlos frowned and tapped the screen, wondering if it had glitched. The GPS refreshed. and still showed mile marker 52. Carlos looked around the rest stop, suddenly uneasy. It looked identical to the rest stop at mile marker 47. The same layout, the same single light pole, the same sandstone formations in the surrounding canyon. But his GPS insisted he was 5 miles further south than he should be. He checked his truck's odometer, tried to remember the last mile marker he'd passed before pulling in. But he'd been on autopilot, following a route he'd driven hundreds of times, not paying attention to specific markers. He started the engine and pulled back onto Highway 54, deciding to trust the GPS over his memory. Maybe he'd miscounted the miles. Maybe he was more tired than he'd thought. He continued south, watching the mile markers carefully now. 53, 54, 55. The GPS tracked perfectly with the markers. At mile marker 61, Carlos saw another rest stop ahead, and his confusion deepened. This shouldn't be here. There was only one rest stop on this stretch of Highway 54, the one at mile marker 47, which he'd just left. But here was another rest stop, and as he got closer, his unease turned to active dread. It was identical. Same layout, same light pole, same vending machines, same sandstone formations. Carlos pulled in, his heart racing, and parked in the exact spot he'd occupied at what he thought was mile marker 47. He got out slowly, looking around carefully. The Dr. Pepper can he'd bought was sitting on top of the vending machine where he'd left it, impossible as that was. The moths spiraled around the light in the same patterns. Even the sounds were identical, the same coyote calls carrying across the desert. Carlos walked to the picnic area and found fresh footprints in the dust, his own footprints from 10 minutes ago, or what should have been 10 minutes ago. He pulled out his phone and checked the time. 3:02 a.m. Exactly 19 minutes had passed since he'd first stopped at the rest area. But according to his GPS, he'd driven 14 miles in that time, which was impossible at the speeds he'd been traveling. He tried calling his dispatcher, but the phone showed no signal, despite usually having good coverage in this area. He walked back to his truck and keyed the CB microphone, trying to raise any other drivers who might be on the highway. "This is Roadrunner Carlos on Highway 54 near mile marker 61. Does anyone copy?" Static answered him, but underneath it, he heard something else. A voice that might have been his own, faint and distorted, saying words he couldn't quite make out. He tried again. "Anyone monitoring Highway 54? This is Roadrunner Carlos requesting someone confirm my location." This time, the static resolved into a voice, but it wasn't responding to him. It was him, he realized with dawning horror, listening to his own voice from the previous transmission, played back with a delay. "This is Roadrunner Carlos on Highway 54 near mile marker 61. Does anyone copy?" Carlos dropped the microphone and stumbled out of the truck. This wasn't right. None of this was right. He was caught in some kind of loop or echo, time and space folding in on themselves. He decided to leave immediately, to keep driving, to not stop again no matter what. He climbed back into his truck, started the engine, and pulled onto the highway, accelerating faster than was safe, desperate to put distance between himself and the rest stop. The mile markers continued in sequence: 62, 63, 64. Carlos kept his eyes fixed on them, counting each one, using them to anchor himself to reality. At mile marker 75, he should have reached the outskirts of Alamogordo, but the desert continued unchanged, empty and dark under the moon. At mile marker 89, he passed the rest stop again. Same location, same layout, same light pole. Except this time, There were 2 trucks parked in the truck spaces, both identical to his own. Same blue cab, same white trailer, same company logos on the doors. Carlos didn't stop, didn't even slow down, just kept driving with his foot pressed hard on the accelerator. His speedometer read 75 miles per hour, faster than he should be traveling on this highway at night, but he couldn't make himself slow down. At mile marker 103, the rest stop appeared again, and this time there were 3 identical trucks. At 117, 4 trucks. Each time, the number increased by 1. Carlos was sobbing now, unable to understand what was happening, why the highway wouldn't end, why the rest stop kept appearing with more copies of his truck each time. At mile marker 131, the rest stop had 15 trucks, all identical, parked in impossible rows that extended beyond the physical boundaries of the rest area. Some of the trucks were running, their lights on, their exhaust visible in the cool desert air. Others sat dark and silent. Carlos slowed despite his terror, unable to resist looking, and he saw drivers standing among the trucks, all wearing the same clothes he wore, all with his face, all staring at the highway as if waiting for something. One of the duplicates turned to look directly at him, raised a hand in warning or greeting, and mouthed words Carlos couldn't hear, but somehow understood. "Don't stop. Keep driving." Carlos punched the accelerator, and the truck surged forward. The rest stopped, disappearing in his mirrors. He drove for what felt like hours, but might have been minutes or days, time losing all meaning as the highway unreeled beneath him, and the mile markers climbed into the hundreds, then the thousands. His fuel gauge showed half full and never moved despite the miles he'd traveled. His clock showed 3:02 a.m. and never changed. Then, between 1 second and the next, something shifted. The quality of the darkness changed, becoming less oppressive. The moon's position jumped from overhead to near the horizon. And most importantly, the mile markers began to make sense again. Carlos saw 47, 48, 49, and recognized that he was back in normal space, the familiar space where physics and geography worked the way they were supposed to. At mile marker 52, he passed a rest stop that looked exactly like the one he'd stopped at. But this time, it was truly empty. No trucks, no cars, just the single light pole and the vending machines, and the sandstone canyon holding it all. Carlos didn't stop. He drove straight through to Alamogordo, completed his delivery, and checked into a motel where he slept for 14 hours straight. When he woke, he checked his truck's GPS history and found that his route from the previous night showed a simple, straight line along Highway 54 with no anomalies, no impossible mileage, no indication that anything strange had happened. His logbook showed a normal trip. Even his fuel consumption matched what it should have been for the distance traveled. Carlos called his dispatcher and requested different routes, said he wanted to avoid Highway 54 for a while. When pressed for a reason, he claimed the road conditions were getting bad, needed maintenance. His dispatcher was skeptical, but agreed. For 6 months, Carlos avoided that highway entirely, taking longer routes that added hours to his trips. But eventually, circumstances forced him back. A rush delivery required the most direct route, and that meant Highway 54 through the empty desert between Carrizozo and Alamogordo. Carlos drove it in daylight, keeping his speed exactly at the limit, paying careful attention to every mile marker. At mile marker 47, the rest stop sat in its familiar position, looking completely normal and innocent. He didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. But as he passed, he glanced at the parking area and saw, just for an instant, a flicker of something impossible. Dozens of trucks, hundreds maybe, all identical, all parked in overlapping rows that existed in the same physical space. And among them, figures moving, all wearing his face, all trapped in that eternal 3:02 a.m., all waiting for something that would never come. Carlos drives Highway 54 regularly now, has learned to accept it as part of his route. But he's developed strict rules that he never breaks. He doesn't stop at the rest stop at mile marker 47, no matter how badly he needs to use the bathroom or how much he wants a soda. He doesn't stop anywhere between mile markers 45 and 65, doesn't even slow down. He makes sure his fuel tank is full before entering that stretch, keeps his CB radio off, and never, under any circumstances, stops his truck between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. on that section of highway. Other drivers have asked him about it, noticed his strange behavior, his refusal to use that rest stop. Carlos tells them it's just superstition, just a quirk he's developed. He never mentions the night he got caught in a loop of his own making, trapped in a recursive nightmare where stopping at a rest stop somehow pulled him out of normal space and time and deposited him in a place where the road never ended, and every stop spawned another copy of himself, another truck, another driver caught in the same impossible moment. Because Carlos knows that the rest stop is still there, still waiting, still offering its services to tired drivers who need a break. And he knows that some of those drivers stop and get back on the highway and continue their journeys without incident. But he also knows that some of them stop and never quite leave, become trapped in an endless loop of identical rest stops appearing every 14 miles, accumulating copies of themselves until they exist in hundreds of places simultaneously, all trying to warn their past selves to keep driving, to never stop, to not make the mistake they made. And Carlos knows, with absolute certainty, that somewhere in that impossible space, there are still versions of himself driving Highway 54, watching mile markers climb into infinity, passing rest stops populated with infinite copies of their own truck, unable to reach the end of a road that has no end, living forever in the 19 minutes between 2:43 a.m. and 3:02 a.m. on a September night in the New Mexico desert. Story 6. The Way Station That Weighed Wrong. Patricia Delaney had been hauling specialized freight for 14 years, building a reputation for handling the difficult loads that required extra attention to weight distribution and regulatory compliance. She carried a certified scale in her truck, checked her weight at every opportunity, and maintained meticulous records, because even a slight overweight violation could cost thousands in fines and damage her professional record. She was proud of her precision, proud that in 14 years she'd never received a weight violation. The way station on I-90 near Rapid City, South Dakota, was one Patricia passed regularly on her runs from Wyoming to Minnesota. It was a modern facility with updated scales and professional staff, and she'd never had any issues there. On a cold November morning, Patricia was hauling machine parts from Gillette, Wyoming, bound for Rochester, Minnesota. Her cargo was heavy but legal, carefully loaded to distribute weight correctly across all axles. She'd weighed at a certified truck stop before leaving Wyoming, had all her paperwork in order, and felt confident and prepared. The All Trucks Must Enter sign was illuminated at the way station, so Patricia pulled in along with several other trucks, following the lane markers to the scale. The process was routine, one she'd performed thousands of times. She rolled onto the scale, stopped when the light indicated, and waited for the system to calculate her weight and give her clearance to continue. The digital display should have shown her truck's weight in pounds. Instead, it showed a number that made no sense. 847,293 pounds. Patricia blinked and looked again. The number hadn't changed. Her truck, fully loaded, should have weighed approximately 76,000 pounds, well within legal limits. The scale was showing her as carrying more than 400 tons, which was impossible. Her truck couldn't physically carry that much weight, and if it could, the suspension would have collapsed, the tires would have exploded, and she'd never have made it up the mountain passes between Gillette and Rapid City. A voice came over the speaker. "Truck on scale 3. Please pull forward to the inspection area." Patricia's stomach sank. She eased the truck forward into the inspection bay, where a weigh station officer was waiting with a clipboard and a stern expression. "Ma'am, are you aware your truck is significantly overweight?" the officer asked as Patricia climbed down from the cab. "Officer, there has to be a mistake with your scale," Patricia said, keeping her voice calm and professional. "I weighed at a certified scale in Gillette this morning, and I was at 75,150 pounds, well within legal limits. There's no way I'm carrying what your scale showed." The officer glanced at his clipboard. "Our scale shows 847,293 pounds. That's more than 10 times the legal limit. I need to see your bill of lading, your weight receipts, and I'll need to inspect your cargo." Patricia provided all the requested documents, including the certified weight receipt from Gillette, showing her correct weight. The officer examined the paperwork with a frown. "Your paperwork shows legal weight, but our scale doesn't lie. We just had it calibrated last week. I'm going to need to manually inspect your load." Patricia opened her trailer and stood back while the officer examined the cargo. Machine parts, properly secured, exactly matching the manifest. Nothing that could possibly account for the impossible weight. The officer spent 20 minutes checking everything, taking photos, making notes. Finally, he returned to Patricia. "Ma'am, I can see your cargo matches your manifest, and the weight on your receipt from Gillette seems legitimate. But I can't explain what our scale is showing. I'm going to have you pull off the scale and try again. See if there was some kind of error." Patricia pulled her truck off the scale, waited while another truck weighed successfully, then pulled back on when directed. The display flickered and settled on a new number, 104,567 pounds, more than the first time. Patricia felt her heart racing. This wasn't just a calibration error. Something was fundamentally wrong. The officer looked genuinely confused now. "That's impossible. Your weight increased while you were parked. You didn't take on any cargo. I watched you the entire time." He paused, studying his clipboard, then looked up at Patricia with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Ma'am, I need to ask you something strange. Do you feel any heavier, any different than usual?" "I feel completely normal," Patricia said. "Officer, what's going on?" "I've worked here for 23 years, the officer said slowly, "and I've seen a lot of strange things come through this weigh station. But I've never seen numbers like this. The scale isn't just showing your truck as overweight. It's showing something else, something beyond weight." "I don't understand," Patricia said, though a cold feeling was spreading through her chest. The officer walked over to the scale control panel and pressed several buttons. A printer whirred to life and spit out a detailed readout. He tore it off and examined it, his frown deepening. According to this, the scale is detecting mass at multiple temporal frequencies. That's not supposed to be possible. Our scales measure weight, not whatever this is. Temporal frequencies? Patricia repeated. What does that mean? I don't know, the officer admitted. I'm going to call our technical support. He walked back to his office, leaving Patricia standing next to her truck, feeling increasingly disconnected from reality. She climbed into her cab and sat there, staring at her hands, confirming they looked normal, solid, real. 15 minutes later, the officer returned with another man wearing a technician's uniform. They conferred quietly, looking at the readout, then approached Patricia. "Ma'am," the technician said, "I'm going to try something unusual. I want you to drive your truck onto the scale one more time, but I'm going to recalibrate the scale to measure something different. This is experimental, and I'm not even sure it will work, but I need you to trust me." Patricia didn't know what else to do, so she agreed. She drove onto the scale again, stopped at the indicator, and waited. The technician worked at the control panel for several minutes, typing commands, adjusting settings. Finally, the display flickered and showed a new type of reading. Not weight in pounds, but something else entirely. A series of numbers and symbols Patricia didn't recognize. The technician stared at the display, his face going pale. "Officer Morrison," he called out, "you need to see this." The officer joined him at the panel, and Patricia watched as both men examined the display with expressions of disbelief. Finally, they walked over to her truck, and the technician spoke, his voice shaking slightly. "Ma'am, according to our equipment, your truck is carrying normal weight, approximately 76,000 pounds, exactly as your paperwork states. But it's also carrying something else. The scale is detecting temporal mass, echoes of your truck from other times, all occupying the same physical space." "I don't understand what that means," Patricia said, her voice barely a whisper. "The scale is seeing your truck as it exists now, but also as it existed in the past, and as it will exist in the future, all simultaneously," the technician explained. "It's measuring the total mass of all those temporal echoes. That's why the weight is so impossibly high. You're not carrying too much cargo. You're carrying too much time." Patricia felt dizzy, disoriented. "How is that possible? How do I fix it?" The two men looked at each other, then back at Patricia. Officer Morrison spoke carefully. "Ma'am, has anything unusual happened to you recently? Any places you've stopped that felt strange? Any incidents that didn't quite make sense?" Patricia thought back over the past few days of driving. Nothing stood out. Nothing except... "There was a truck stop," she said slowly, "in Montana 3 days ago. I stopped there to refuel, and everything seemed normal. But when I came back out from paying, my truck was in a different parking spot. I thought I'd misremembered where I'd parked, but the fuel receipt timestamp showed I'd been inside for 40 minutes when it only felt like 5. I didn't think much of it at the time." The technician nodded grimly. "There are thin places scattered across the highway system, locations where time doesn't flow quite right. Sounds like you parked in one. Sometimes when that happens, people pick up echoes, temporal shadows that attach to them and their vehicles. You're not just Patricia Delaney from November 15th, 2024 anymore. You're also Patricia Delaney from multiple other times, all existing in the same space, and our scale is sensitive enough to detect the mass of all those versions. "How do I get rid of them?" Patricia asked, fighting down panic. "You can't," Officer Morrison said gently. "At least, not intentionally. Temporal echoes fade over time, usually. Most people never even know they're carrying them because most scales can't detect them. You just had the bad luck to hit a way station with experimental equipment. So what do I do?" "We're going to clear you to proceed," Officer Morrison said. "Your actual cargo weight is legal, and that's all that matters for regulatory purposes. The temporal mass isn't cargo. It's something else entirely, and there are no laws about it, because officially it doesn't exist. But I need to note this in my report, and you might want to avoid this particular way station for a while." Patricia was given clearance papers and allowed to continue her trip. She drove in a daze, constantly checking her mirrors, looking for signs of the temporal echoes the technician had described. She saw nothing unusual, just her truck, her trailer, the highway behind her. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed, that there were other versions of herself occupying the same space, driving the same route, making the same stops. At a rest area near Mitchell, South Dakota, Patricia pulled in to use the restroom. When she came back out, she saw something that confirmed her fears. In the parking lot, she could see faint outlines of her truck in multiple positions, translucent ghost images overlapping her solid vehicle. As she watched, one of the ghost images opened its door, and a translucent version of herself climbed down and walked toward the restroom building, passing right through the solid Patricia without acknowledgement. Patricia rushed to her truck, climbed in, and sat shaking in the driver's seat. She pulled out her phone and tried to call someone, anyone. But who would she call? Who would believe this? She settled for texting her dispatcher, saying she needed a few days off after completing the current delivery, claiming she wasn't feeling well. The dispatcher agreed without question. The rest of the trip to Rochester was a nightmare. At every stop, Patricia saw more ghost images of herself and her truck, sometimes just a few, sometimes dozens, all slightly out of phase with each other, all doing slightly different things. At a truck stop near Worthington, Minnesota, she watched in horror as ghost versions of her truck pulled in and parked in a chaotic, overlapping arrangement. 20 or 30 vehicles occupying the same parking spots, their drivers all wearing her face, all moving with her gestures, all existing in slightly different times. She completed the delivery in Rochester and drove straight home to her apartment in St. Paul, arriving at 4 a.m. after driving straight through without stopping except for fuel. She climbed into bed and slept fitfully, dreaming of scales that measured impossible weights and highways that existed in multiple times simultaneously. Over the following weeks, the temporal echoes began to fade, just as Officer Morrison had said they would. Patricia stopped seeing ghost images of herself at truck stops and rest areas. Her truck stopped appearing in multiple positions simultaneously. But she knew the echoes weren't truly gone, just invisible to her, still surrounding her like shadows that existed in dimensions she couldn't perceive. She never returned to the way station near Rapid City, and she never stopped at that truck stop in Montana again. She requested routes that avoided both locations, told her dispatcher she preferred different paths, even if they took longer. When asked why, she said it was just personal preference, nothing more. But Patricia knows the truth. She knows that she's still carrying temporal mass, still surrounded by echoes of herself from other times. She knows because sometimes, late at night, when she's alone in her truck, she can feel them, the weight of all those other versions of herself pressing in from times that haven't happened yet or have already passed. And sometimes, when she's very tired and the highway is very dark, she can hear them on her CB radio, voices that sound exactly like her own, reporting road conditions from dates that don't exist, warning about hazards that haven't occurred, living in moments that overlap and intersect with her present in ways that physics can't explain. She'll key her microphone and hear herself answer back, a chorus of her own voice speaking from multiple times, all saying the same thing. Keep driving. The echoes fade, but never disappear. You'll carry them forever now. The weight of all the times you've lived and will live, all pressing down on the same point in space, making you heavier than any scale can truly measure, except for one experimental scale at a way station in South Dakota that once, for just a few minutes, was calibrated to measure not weight, but time itself, and found that you, Patricia Delaney, weigh not 76,000 pounds, but the accumulated mass of an entire lifetime of journeys, all happening simultaneously in the eternal present that truckers inhabit when they spend enough time on the highways where time doesn't flow quite right. Story 7. The Cargo That Changed. Leonard Bass had been hauling specialized freight for 16 years, handling everything from industrial chemicals to livestock, but his specialty was refrigerated transport. He had a reputation for delivering temperature-sensitive cargo in perfect condition, maintaining cold, chains without interruption, and never losing a load to spoilage. His refrigerated trailer was top of the line, equipped with redundant cooling systems and constant monitoring equipment that alerted him immediately to any temperature fluctuations. On a March afternoon, Leonard picked up a load from a pharmaceutical distribution center outside Newark, New Jersey, bound for a research facility in Atlanta. The cargo was medical specimens, biological samples that required constant refrigeration at precisely 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The manifest listed the containers as containing tissue samples for cancer research, valuable and time-sensitive. Leonard had transported similar loads dozens of times, understood the protocols, and took pride in his professional handling of medical cargo. The loading process was routine. Leonard watched as workers secured 18 containers in his trailer, each one clearly labeled with biohazard symbols and handling instructions. The facility supervisor checked the temperature settings personally, verified Leonard's refrigeration system was functioning correctly, and provided detailed documentation. Leonard signed the paperwork, did his pre-trip inspection, and pulled out of the facility at 3:15 p.m., planning to drive straight through to Atlanta with only brief stops for fuel. The first 4 hours were uneventful. Leonard made good time through New Jersey and into Pennsylvania, his monitoring equipment showing the trailer maintaining a steady 38 degrees. Traffic was light, weather was clear, and Leonard settled into the comfortable rhythm of long-distance driving, listening to an audiobook and watching the miles accumulate. Around 7:30 p.m., somewhere on I-81 in southern Pennsylvania, Leonard's temperature monitoring system chirped an alert. He glanced at the display and frowned. The trailer temperature had spiked to 42 degrees, still within safe range but higher than it should be. He adjusted the thermostat and watched as the system worked to bring the temperature back down. Within 10 minutes, it had returned to 38 degrees, and Leonard relaxed, attributing the spike to the refrigeration unit cycling normally. 30 minutes later, the alert sounded again. This time, the temperature showed 45 degrees. Leonard pulled onto the shoulder, put on his hazard lights, and climbed out to check the refrigeration unit. It was running normally, compressor humming, coolant lines cold to the touch. He couldn't identify any mechanical issues. He climbed back into the cab and cranked the refrigeration down to its coldest setting, watching the temperature drop back to target range. At his next fuel stop near Harrisburg, Leonard walked around to the back of the trailer and opened the doors to visually inspect the cargo. Cool air washed over him, and he could see all 18 containers, exactly where they should be, properly secured, no visible damage or leaks. Everything appeared normal. He closed the doors and continued driving, but a nagging unease had settled into his gut. The temperature alerts continued at irregular intervals throughout the night, sometimes going an hour without issue, sometimes alerting every 15 minutes. Each time, Leonard would adjust the settings, and each time, the temperature would stabilize. But by the time he crossed into Virginia around 2 a.m., he was dealing with alerts every few minutes, the temperature fluctuating wildly, despite his refrigeration system running at maximum capacity. Leonard decided to pull into a rest area and call the pharmaceutical company's emergency number to report the issue. The rest area was nearly empty at that hour, just his truck and one other vehicle in the parking lot. Leonard found the contact number on his paperwork and made the call. A woman answered immediately, her voice professional and alert despite the hour. "This is Apex Pharmaceuticals' emergency line. How can I help you?" Leonard explained the situation, described the temperature fluctuations, and his inability to stabilize the system. The woman asked several questions about the refrigeration unit, took down his location, and then was silent for a moment. "Mr. Bass, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it immediately. I want you to open your trailer doors and inspect the containers. Tell me exactly what you see." "I inspected them at my last stop," Leonard said. "Everything looked normal." "I need you to look again," the woman insisted. "Right now. I'll stay on the line." Leonard walked to the back of his trailer, feeling increasingly uneasy. He unlocked the doors, swung them open, and aimed his flashlight at the cargo. Then he stood frozen, his breath catching in his throat. The containers were still there, all 18 of them, but they had changed. The labels were different, showing not biohazard symbols but something else, a logo he didn't recognize, and text in a language that looked like English, but used letters and symbols he'd never seen before. "Mr. Bass?" The woman's voice came through his phone. "What do you see?" "The containers. They're different," Leonard said, his voice shaking. "The labels changed. I don't understand. They're not the same containers I loaded." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, "Mr. Bass, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I need you to listen carefully. The cargo you're carrying is unstable, not in a chemical sense, but in a quantum sense. The specimens we sent you exist in a superposition of states until they're observed. Each time you open the trailer doors, you're collapsing the quantum wave function, but the collapse isn't consistent. You're seeing different versions of the cargo, depending on when and where you observe it. Leonard felt his legs go weak. That's impossible. That's not how biology works. It is when the biology has been deliberately engineered to exist in multiple quantum states, the woman said. Mr. Bass, this is a classified research project. The specimens you're carrying are experimental tissue cultures designed to exist in quantum superposition. We needed to transport them without observing them too frequently, which is why we specifically requested a driver with a perfect track record who wouldn't need to check the cargo repeatedly. But the temperature fluctuations forced you to observe them. And now, you're collapsing the wave functions in unpredictable ways. Leonard leaned against his trailer, trying to process what he was being told. So what do I do? Do I bring them back? Do I stop looking at them? You need to complete the delivery, the woman said. But Mr. Bass, I need to warn you. Each time you observe the cargo, you're changing it. You're selecting one version of reality from an infinite number of possibilities. The cargo might look different each time you check. The labels might change, the contents might change, but all the versions are real. All of them exist simultaneously until you observe them. Do you understand? No, Leonard said honestly. I don't understand at all. Then just trust me and drive. Don't open the trailer doors again until you reach the facility in Atlanta. No matter what the temperature monitors show, no matter what alerts you get, just keep the refrigeration running and drive. Can you do that? Leonard wanted to say no, wanted to refuse this insane cargo and demand someone else take it. But he was already halfway to Atlanta, already committed. I can do it, he said finally. He closed the trailer doors without looking at the containers again, climbed back into his cab, and continued driving. The temperature alerts continued throughout the night, but Leonard ignored them, focused on the road, on the white lines disappearing beneath his wheels, on anything except what might be happening in his trailer. As dawn broke over North Carolina, Leonard's CB radio crackled to life with a voice he didn't recognize. Leonard Bass, this is Dr. Caroline Morrison from the Atlanta Research Facility. I know you've been instructed not to observe the cargo, but I need you to check it one more time before you arrive. The quantum signatures we're receiving from your trailer are off the charts. We need to know which version of the specimens you're bringing us. Leonard keyed his microphone with trembling hands. The woman I spoke to last night said not to look again. There was no woman, Dr. Morrison said. Our emergency line wasn't staffed last night. We had a system malfunction. Whoever you spoke to, it wasn't one of our employees. Leonard felt ice water in his veins. Then who did I talk to? I don't know, Dr. Morrison admitted. But I need you to check the cargo now. We need to know what's coming. Leonard pulled off the highway at the next exit, his hands shaking so badly he could barely control the steering wheel. He parked in a gas station lot and walked to his trailer, on legs that felt like they might collapse. He unlocked the doors, took a deep breath, and opened them. The trailer was empty, completely empty. No containers, no cargo, no evidence that anything had ever been loaded. Leonard stood staring at the empty space, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were showing him. He walked inside the trailer, his footsteps echoing in the metal box, running his hands along the walls, as if the containers might be invisible. Nothing. They were gone. He called the number Dr. Morrison had used to contact him on the CB, but it went to a non-existent number error. He called the pharmaceutical company's main line and got a receptionist who told him they had no Dr. Caroline Morrison on staff and no record of any shipment scheduled to him the previous day. He pulled out his paperwork and found that the bill of lading was blank. No cargo listed, no destination, just empty forms with his name at the top. Leonard sat in his empty trailer and tried to understand what had happened. The loading in Newark had been real. He'd watched it happen, had signed paperwork, had monitored the temperature all night. But now, there was no evidence any of it had occurred. The cargo had existed and then somehow ceased to exist, or had never existed except in his observation of it, or existed in some quantum state that his looking at it wrong had caused to collapse into nothing. He drove the empty trailer to Atlanta anyway, found the address that had been on the paperwork before it went blank. The research facility was real, a modern complex with security gates and guards. Leonard explained his situation to the gate guard, described the cargo he'd been carrying, mentioned Dr. Morrison's name. The guard made several phone calls, then told Leonard to wait. 20 minutes later, a woman in a white lab coat emerged from the facility and approached Leonard's truck. She introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chen, director of the facility's quantum biology department. "Mr. Bass, I think I understand what happened to you. Come inside, please. There are things you need to know." In a conference room with windows that overlooked a parking lot, Dr. Chen explained that her facility was conducting experimental research into quantum state biological materials, organisms that existed in multiple states until observed. "We did ship materials to Newark 3 days ago," she said, "but they were scheduled to return here via a different carrier who had been specially trained in quantum observation protocols. Somehow you received those materials instead, and your observation of them throughout the transport caused the quantum states to collapse in unpredictable ways." "But where did they go?" Leonard asked. "They can't just disappear." "They didn't disappear," Dr. Chen said. "They collapsed into one specific state when you made your final observation, and that state happened to be non-existence in your perceived timeline. The specimens still exist in other timelines, other versions of this transport, where you made different observations, and the quantum collapses resolved differently. In some versions of reality, you successfully delivered the cargo. In others, the specimens transformed into something else entirely. In this version, they resolved into a state where they were never loaded in the first place." "That's insane," Leonard said weakly. "Yes," Dr. Chen agreed. "It is. And that's why we're suspending all quantum transport experiments indefinitely. Your experience has taught us that we can't safely move materials in quantum superposition through normal commercial channels. The risk of uncontrolled collapse is too high." Leonard left the facility with a check for his delivery fee, despite having delivered nothing, a non-disclosure agreement he signed without reading, and a mind full of questions that would never be answered. He drove home to New Jersey in his empty trailer, constantly checking his mirrors, half expecting to see the cargo reappear in some new quantum state. It's been 2 years since that transport, and Leonard still drives refrigerated freight, still maintains his perfect safety record. But he's developed strange habits that other drivers notice. He never opens his trailer doors during transport, not for any reason, no matter what his monitoring systems tell him. He refuses to haul pharmaceutical cargo or anything labeled as research materials. And late at night, when he's alone on empty highways, he sometimes opens the trailer doors at rest stops and stares into the empty space, wondering if the cargo is still there in some other version of reality. If somewhere there's a Leonard Bass who successfully delivered 18 containers of quantum state specimens and never knew that those specimens existed in infinite versions across infinite timelines, all collapsed into different states by the simple act of observation. He'll stand there for minutes, searching the empty trailer for signs of cargo that exists and doesn't exist simultaneously, before finally closing the doors and continuing his journey, carrying nothing but air and the weight of infinite possibilities that collapsed into nothing the moment he looked at them wrong. Story 8. The Highway That Went Backward. Vernon Mitchell had been an owner-operator for 25 years, driving his own truck, choosing his own routes, building a client base that valued his reliability and experience. He specialized in cross-country hauls, the long journeys that took him from coast to coast, through landscapes that changed dramatically over thousands of miles. Vernon loved the variety, loved seeing the country from his cab, loved the freedom that came with being his own boss. On a clear August evening, Vernon picked up a load of electronics from a warehouse in Sacramento, bound for a distribution center in Columbus, Ohio. It was a straightforward route, one he'd driven dozens of times. I-80 east across Nevada, Wyoming, Nebraska, Iowa, all the way to Ohio. He'd planned fuel stops, scheduled his rest breaks, and expected to make the delivery in 3 days with normal driving. The first day was perfect. Vernon made excellent time across Nevada and into Wyoming, stopped for the night at a truck stop in Rock Springs, got 8 hours of sleep, and started day 2 feeling refreshed and alert. He crossed into Nebraska around noon, ate lunch at a truck stop near Sydney, and continued east on I-80 through the wide-open prairie. Around 4 p.m., somewhere between Sydney and North Platte, Vernon noticed something odd about the mile markers. They were counting backward. He passed mile marker 102, then 101, then 100. Vernon frowned and checked his GPS, which showed him traveling east correctly, making normal progress. But the mile markers were clearly descending instead of ascending. He keyed his CB microphone. Any eastbound drivers on I-80 in Nebraska, you noticing anything strange about the mile markers? A voice responded immediately. This is Oakley eastbound near Ogallala. What are you seeing? Mile markers are counting backward, Vernon said. I'm heading east, but the numbers are going down. You seeing the same thing? Negative, the voice said. My markers are counting up normal. You sure you're not turned around somehow? Vernon checked his compass, checked his GPS again, looked at the sun's position to confirm direction. He was definitely traveling east. The sun was ahead of him, and to the right, exactly where it should be in the late afternoon. But the mile markers continued to count backward. 99, 98, 97. He decided to ignore it, assuming there was some construction or repair work that had caused the markers to be temporarily misnumbered. He continued driving, watching the numbers descend, trying not to let it bother him. But around mile marker 75, he noticed something else. The landscape was changing, but not in the right direction. He was passing landmarks he'd seen hours ago, rest stops he'd already passed. A distinctive water tower near Lodgepole appeared on his left, but Vernon clearly remembered passing that tower around 10 a.m., heading east and seeing it on his right side. He pulled off at the next exit and parked at a gas station, trying to orient himself. His GPS showed him near Lodgepole, exactly where the water tower indicated. But that meant he'd somehow lost 4 hours of driving and over 200 miles of progress. He'd driven forward all day, but ended up further west than he'd been at lunch. Vernon walked into the gas station and asked the clerk what time it was. The clerk glanced at the clock on the wall. 4:23 p.m. Vernon's watch showed 4:23 p.m. His phone showed 4:23 p.m. The time was correct, but his position wasn't. He bought a coffee and sat in his truck, trying to understand what had happened. He decided to start over, to drive east again and pay careful attention to every detail. He pulled back onto I-80 and accelerated to cruising speed, watching the mile markers closely. This time they counted backwards slowly at first, then faster. Mile marker 70, then 69, then 68, 67, 66, the numbers descending at a pace that matched his forward speed. Vernon's heart was pounding. He was driving east. He could feel the truck moving forward, could see the road ahead unreeling beneath his wheels. But somehow he was going backward through the mile markers. At mile marker 50, he passed the gas station where he'd just stopped. He could see his parking spot, empty now, could see the clerk through the window. But he'd just left that place 20 minutes ago, had driven east for 20 miles. Now he was passing it again, from the same direction, as if his 20 miles of eastward travel had somehow looped him back. Vernon tried to stop, but his foot on the brake pedal did nothing. The truck continued at the same speed, ignoring his input. He tried the parking brake, tried shifting to neutral, tried turning the key to shut off the engine. Nothing responded. The truck drove itself, maintaining exactly 65 miles per hour, traveling east while the mile markers counted backward, and the landscape repeated itself. At mile marker 25, Vernon passed the truck stop where he'd eaten lunch. He could see through the windows into the restaurant, could see drivers sitting at the counter, including one who looked disturbingly like himself, eating a burger and reading his phone. Vernon grabbed his CB microphone with shaking hands. "This is Smoky Vernon eastbound at mile marker 25. Does anyone copy? I need help. My truck won't stop." The radio crackled and his own voice answered. "This is Smoky Vernon at the Sydney truck stop. I copy you. What do you mean your truck won't stop?" Vernon looked at his mirrors and saw the Sydney truck stop receding behind him. Impossible as that was because he'd left Sydney hours ago. "I don't know how to explain this," Vernon said. "I'm driving east but going backward through mile markers, and now I'm hearing myself on the radio. Something is very wrong." "Vernon, this is going to sound crazy," his own voice responded. "But I think you're calling me from further east on I-80. I'm having lunch in Sydney right now, planning to drive east this afternoon. Are you telling me I'm going to run into some kind of problem?" "I don't know what I'm telling you," Vernon said desperately. "I'm watching the mile markers count backward. I'm passing places I already passed hours ago. My truck won't respond to controls. I just passed mile marker 20, and I'm running out of road." The other Vernon was silent for a moment. Then, "Vernon, I want you to look carefully at your surroundings. Tell me exactly what you see." Vernon looked around desperately. The highway, the prairie, the fence posts along the shoulder, all exactly as they should be. Except for one thing: the shadows. The sun was ahead of him, but the shadows were behind him, as if the light was coming from the wrong direction. The Shadows are wrong, Vernon said. Everything is backward. You're not driving east, the other Vernon said quietly. You're driving into east, but through the mirror. You're on the highway, but reflected, traveling backward through space, while moving forward through time. Or maybe backward through time, while moving forward through space. I don't understand the physics, but that's what's happening. Mile marker 10 passed by. Vernon was approaching the Colorado-Nebraska border, but from the wrong direction. How do I get out of this? Vernon asked, trying to keep panic from his voice. I don't think you do, his other self said. I think you keep driving until you reach wherever this reflected highway goes. I'm sorry, Vernon. I think what's happening to you is going to happen to me in a few hours, and I don't know how to prevent it. Mile marker 5, 4, 3. The Colorado state line approached. Vernon braced himself, expecting something dramatic when he crossed the border, but nothing changed. He simply continued into Colorado, the mile markers now counting up from 1, 2, 3, but the sun still in the wrong position, the shadows still reversed. The landscape began to change in subtle ways. Colors were slightly off, greens too vivid, blues too deep. Buildings appeared that hadn't existed before, structures that looked almost normal but not quite, as if designed by someone who understood buildings conceptually, but had never actually seen one. Other vehicles appeared on the highway, but they moved strangely, their motion too smooth, too perfect, as if animated rather than driven. At mile marker 50 into Colorado, Vernon saw another version of his truck approaching from ahead, traveling west in the eastbound lanes. As it got closer, he could see himself driving it, could see his own face through the windshield, eyes wide with terror. The two trucks passed each other, and Vernon twisted in his seat to watch in his mirrors as the other truck continued west, heading toward Nebraska, toward the same trap Vernon had fallen into. The CB crackled. This is Smokey Vernon at the Sydney truck stop. Just got off the phone with myself from the future or the past. I don't even know anymore. To any driver heading east on I-80 this afternoon, be warned. Something happens between Sydney and North Platte that puts you on a reflected highway, a road that runs backward. Multiple versions of me are reporting the same thing. We're all trapped in some kind of loop, driving east but going west, passing ourselves, calling ourselves on the radio. If you're monitoring this channel and you're approaching Nebraska, turn around. Take a different route. Don't drive I-80 today. Vernon added his own warning. This is Smokey Vernon at mile marker 50 in Colorado, confirming the same experience. The highway is reflected somehow. You'll drive forward, but go backward, pass landmarks multiple times. See yourself coming the other way. I don't know how to escape it. I've been driving for hours, but I'm getting further from my destination, not closer. More voices joined the CB, all of them Vernon's own voice, reporting from different locations along I-80. Some in Nebraska, some in Colorado, some even further east in Wyoming, or further west in Utah. Dozens of Vernons, all trapped on the same reflected highway, all driving toward destinations they would never reach, all calling out warnings that past versions of themselves would ignore or fail to receive. Vernon drove for hours, or maybe days, time losing its meaning as the sun stayed fixed in the same position, and his clock refused to advance past 4:23 p.m. He passed through landscapes that were almost but not quite Nebraska, Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas. Landscapes that existed in reflections of themselves, mirror worlds where the shadows fell wrong, and the colors were too intense, and the buildings looked like they'd been drawn rather than built. He saw himself passing in the opposite direction dozens of times, each version at a different stage of panic or acceptance. Some versions waved, some screamed warnings, some just stared ahead with dead eyes, clearly having given up. Vernon tried to count how many versions he saw, but lost track after 30. The CB remained alive with his own voice, broadcasting from multiple times and locations, creating a chorus of warnings and confessions and desperate pleas for help. Vernon heard himself from hours ago, just beginning to notice the backward mile markers. He heard himself from hours in the future, having driven so long on the reflected highway that he'd forgotten what normal roads were like. He heard himself from sideways in time, reporting from locations that didn't exist, from highways that branched off into impossible directions. At some point, Vernon stopped trying to understand or escape. He simply drove, one hand on the wheel, the other holding his CB microphone, adding his own warnings to the chorus. He watched the mile markers count up and down in patterns that made no mathematical sense. He saw landscapes that couldn't exist outside of dreams. He passed himself again and again, a parade of identical trucks driven by identical drivers, all trapped in the same impossible journey. And somewhere in the endless driving, Vernon began to understand that he wasn't on a highway anymore. Not really. He was on the concept of a highway, the idea of I-80 that existed in some platonic space where all highways were the same highway, where east and west were just suggestions, where time and distance had separated from their physical meanings and become pure abstraction. He was driving through the map instead of the territory, following lines on a diagram that represented roads, but weren't roads, just ideas of roads, reflections of roads, shadows cast by the real I-80 onto some lower dimension, where drivers who made wrong turns at wrong times found themselves trapped. The CB continued its chorus of Vernon voices, warnings that would never be received in time, confessions that would never be heard by anyone but other versions of the confessor. Vernon added his own voice to the mix, not because he thought it would help, but because speaking made him feel less alone, made him part of a community, even if that community was just infinite versions of himself scattered across reflected highways in mirror worlds. And Vernon drives still, or some version of Vernon does, on some version of I-80 that exists between the real highway and its reflection, between the map and the territory, between the journey and the destination. Other Vernons have found ways out, have somehow made turns onto exits that led back to reality. But this Vernon, the one telling this story, is still driving east while going west, still watching mile markers count backward while time refuses to move forward, still broadcasting warnings on Channel 19 to anyone who might be listening, though the only response is ever his own voice, calling back from a different point on the same impossible loop. He tells himself that eventually he'll find the way out, will make the right turn at the right moment, and return to normal highways and linear time. But deep down, he knows the truth, that he's been driving for years or decades or centuries, that his truck's fuel tank has never emptied despite never being filled, that his body has neither aged nor hungered, that he exists now as a permanent fixture of the reflected highway. One more warning marker for other drivers who might make the same wrong turn on the same cursed stretch of road. One more voice on the CB calling out coordinates that don't exist, and warnings that come too late, forever traveling east while going backward, forever approaching a destination he left behind hours or miles or lifetimes ago. Forever. Vernon Mitchell on the highway that only goes one direction by going all directions. The road that leads everywhere by going nowhere. The reflected I-80, where every driver who gets lost eventually meets themselves coming the other way.